Well, as I mentioned, we have quite a few people that are going to be baptized today. But before we do that, I wanted us just to take a few moments and look at a story in the Bible that I think will both encourage us and challenge us and help remind us a little bit again about the significance of what we're about to participate in here in a few moments. It's found in John chapter 9. Let me read this story and then just share a few thoughts with us. It says, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? Jesus said, it's not because of his sins or his parents' sin. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the task assigned us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I'm here in this world, I am the light of the world. And then he spit on the ground, made mud with saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. And he told him, I want you to go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? I mean, some said he was, and others said, no, he just looks like him. But the beggar kept saying, yes, I am the same one. Well, they asked, well, who healed you? What happened? And he told them, well, the man they called Jesus made mud, and he spread it over my eyes. And he told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and I washed, and now I can see. Pretty amazing story, isn't it? Story doesn't end there. In fact, what we read on, and we will read a little bit more here in just a minute, but what we find is that, as the neighbors and the people that knew him and were trying to figure all this out, they ended up taking this blind guy who had been restored, who could now see, and they take him to the Pharisees, to the religious leaders of that day. And we know from the Bible that these religious leaders and the Pharisees, they hated Jesus with a passion. They were threatened by him. They were afraid of losing their power and control. And they were trying to find ways that they would be able to kill Jesus. And so here's this blind man. He ultimately appears before the Pharisees. The neighbors bring him. He appears before the Pharisees. And it's interesting that all these guys can think about is not whether the guy was healed or not from being blind, but it was, so did he do that on the Sabbath? Because for them, they were all hung up on that Jesus worked on the Sabbath. Well, let's pick up the story in verse 17. The Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, so, what is your opinion about this man who healed you? The man replied, well, I think he must be a prophet. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see, so they called in his parents and they asked them, so, is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he now see? His parents replied, well, we know this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. But we don't know how he can see or who healed him. You need to ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, he's old enough, ask him. So for the second time, they called in the man who'd been blind, and they told him, God should get the glory for this because we know this man, Jesus, he's a sinner. I don't know whether he's a sinner, the man replied, but I do know this. I was blind, and now I can see. But what did he do, they asked. How did he heal you? Look, the man exclaimed, I told you once, didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? I mean, do you want to become his disciples too? Well, they cursed him and said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. And we know that God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from. Why? That's very strange, the man replied. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he's ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. And ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone who's been born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. You were born a total sinner, they answered. Are you trying to teach us? And they threw him out of the synagogue. When Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man answered, well, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. You have seen him, Jesus said, and he is speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. So what do we learn from this story? I mean, what are some takeaways, some ways to apply this story to our lives? Let me just share two quick things with you. Here's the first one. Every follower of Jesus has a transformation story. Followers of Jesus have transformation stories. And the same way that the blind man could say, I was blind, but now I see. If you are a follower of Jesus, here's our story. Our story is, I was this, but now I am this. I was like this before I became a Christian, but now that I've become a Christian, this is what's different. This is what's being changed in my life. Every Christian has a transformation story. Now, they don't all look the same. I mean, for this blind guy, his was about a miraculous healing. I know some people, and I bet you do too, people that you've talked to that said, I had a whole bunch of people praying for me. Maybe they even had the elders lay hands on them and pray over them. And they went to the doctor, for some issue they were dealing with. The doctor said, I don't know, I can't explain it, but it appears to be gone. What you were dealing with appears to have been healed some way. I don't know how to explain this. I know people that is their story. Sometimes that's the transformation story. Sometimes the transformation story, though, is one in which it says, I was going through a tough time and we prayed and we didn't understand why all this stuff was happening in my life, but I had this peace in my life. I had this sense of it's going to be okay, and this sense that God was going to see me through, even though my circumstance didn't change quite the way maybe that I'd hoped to. That was their transformation story. For others, maybe your transformation story is one of victory over addiction. Or maybe it is that there was something else that had control of your life. You found yourself to be an angry person, or you found yourself to be consumed with anxiety. And you have, because of God's help, been able to see victory, and you've been able to make progress in those areas of your life. Maybe for you it's been some act of provision that God has provided, or a restored relationship. I mean, the list goes on, but this is what I want us to see today. If you are a follower of Jesus, you have a transformation story. I mean, here in a few minutes, as you listen to the testimonies of these people that are about to be baptized, you are going to hear transformation story after transformation story after transformation story. So let me ask you this question today. What is your transformation story? What is it? And here really is my hope and my prayer for you. If you are a Christian and you are in a growing relationship with Jesus, your transformation story isn't just going to be what took place when you became a Christian. It's going to continue on and say, and there were other times in my life that certain things happened and I did certain things and I experienced this kind of transformation. And then I experienced this kind of transformation a little bit later. If you are a Christian, your life from the moment you become a Christian to the day that you leave this earth should be one continual story of transformation and transformation and transformation. Because that's what an encounter with Jesus does. This is who I was, and this is what I've become. Just like for the blind man. I was blind, but now I see. So what's your transformation story? Perhaps you're thinking to yourself, I don't really know if I have one. Well, let's just talk about that for a minute. Because I think there can be several things that could be going on with that. One of those things could be, quite frankly, is that I find that a lot of Christians just don't think much about their transformation story. They just get caught up in doing life, and they really don't think, they think about, well, I'm a Christian, I'm going to go to heaven one day, I've been forgiven of my sins, and I'm just going to go live my life. And they don't really think about the difference that their relationship with Jesus is making, about what their life would be like without Jesus. So sometimes the fact that we struggle to tell our transformation story or even think about it, it's just because we don't really dwell on it enough. We should do that more. There is something good that happens in our life, and it enables us to be able to tell others about the story whenever we think about, so what is my life like now with Jesus? And what would it be if I did not have Jesus in my life? So sometimes the reason we don't know our transformation story is because we don't think about it enough. But maybe here's the other reason. Maybe it is that it's possible that you're not a Christian. And I'm not trying to seed doubt today in your relationship, but I want you to know this. A relationship with Jesus Christ, an encounter with Jesus, should bring about some kind of transformation. It really should. And if that's not in your life today, I would just encourage you to ask yourself seriously, So am I really a follower of Christ? Am I really a Christian? Now, I find that, there's so much confusion about this today. A lot of people just think, well, I'm a pretty good person. I try to be a good person. I believe in God. I must be a Christian. Or my parents are Christian, and when I fill out the forms that ask me what my faith is or what my religion is, I put Christian because I'm nothing else. I don't know. That's the thing that best defines me. Well, let me just suggest this to you today. When you study the Bible talks about how becoming a Christian requires a choice. Jesus said this. He said, you can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. The highway to hell is broad, and its gate is wide for the many who choose that way. But the gateway to life is very narrow, and the road is difficult, and only a few ever find it. Now, I tell you why I bring up that scripture. Because here's Jesus, and he says, going down life is like going down a road, and it's a big road. It's the road that everybody, for the most part, that the majority of people are taking. It's the way that's kind of the easy way where you just do your own thing. The problem is that road is broad, and it leads straight to hell. And then there's this narrow way, and Jesus says, that path is my path. That path requires a choice to get off the wide way, the easy way, the broad way, the one that the majority of everybody else is doing. It requires a choice to say, I don't want to do that. I want to go this direction instead, a direction toward Jesus Christ and following him. I often say, as I study the Bible, this is what I understand the Bible to teach. The Bible basically says that becoming a Christian, making that choice to take the narrow road, involves three things. It involves a choice to believe in Jesus Christ, to believe that he was God, that he came to the earth, that he died on a cross, that he rose from the dead, that he ascended into heaven, that he's coming back again one day. It's a choice to believe that. It's a decision to say, I ask God to forgive me of my sins. I acknowledge that I've done wrong things in my life, and I ask God to forgive me of my sins. And it is a choice to surrender your life to him. Here's something else Jesus said in Luke chapter 9. He said, if any of you wants to be my follower, now get this next phrase, you must give up your own way. Give up your own way. Take up your cross daily and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. The choice to take the narrow path is a choice that says, I'm willing to give up my own way. And I'm willing to start surrendering my life to Jesus. And the way that he wants me to live my life, that's how I choose to live it. Even though most people are going down the broad path, I choose not to go down that path. Friends, listen, if you have never made that choice to become a Christian, it isn't just that I believe in God, I go to church some, I pray some. That is not what makes you a Christian. It requires a decision, a conscious choice. A choice to believe in Jesus, to confess your sins, and a choice to surrender your life to him. And if you've never done that, you're going to lack the transformation story, and your life is not going to be all that God created it to be. And you can do that right now where you're seated here. You can do it where you're watching from. Today, as you listen to these testimonies, you're going to hear all of these. They're going to share about their choice in just a few moments. And if you feel God nudging at your heart to say, you need to make a choice, I challenge you to make that choice today. Today. Now, here's the other thing from that story we read a moment ago. Not only do we see that if you're a Christian, a follower of Jesus, that we have a transformation story, but we also learn here that we should tell others about the impact that following Jesus has had on our life. I want you to think about this with me. So, in this story that we read, we have all kinds of different people involved. We got the neighbors. When the neighbors saw this blind guy that was healed, they have some skepticism. Like, really? Is this the right guy? They were surprised by this. They couldn't quite put it all together. They actually tried to figure it out by going to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, they showed their own disbelief and their own prejudice because they hated Jesus so much. They wanted nothing to do with any of this. His parents, while they knew what had happened, they were afraid to come clean about it because they were afraid of what it might cost them in their relationships and being able to go to the synagogue and that they might lose their friends. But even though all of these people questioned the man that was healed, and even though that all of these people kind of questioned it, this guy that was blind, for him it was real simple. Hey, listen, I was blind, but now I see. I met up with this guy. Everybody calls him Jesus. I don't even know much about the guy. I hear he did some miracles. And when I got there, he spit on the ground and he made mud out of his saliva and he took it and he wiped it on my eyes and he said, go to the pool of Siloam. And so I went. And then when I came back and I washed in the pool of Siloam, all of a sudden I could see. I don't know any more about this. I don't quite understand what happened to me, but I'm telling you, I was blind, but now I see. That's my story. And please don't miss this. No matter how many times people tried to tell him and confront him that his story wasn't true, he never once backed down. Not once. You can say whatever you want. I just know I was blind and now I see. That's what I know. And I know when I came face to face with Jesus and I heard that he was the Son of Man and I knew that this was the guy that healed me, ultimately I gave my life to him and I worshiped him. And I'm not ashamed to tell anybody about what had happened to me because that's my story. Friends, you and I, we have a story to tell. All of us do. And God wants us to tell that story to others. You know, I just challenge you, you know, when people ask you questions, you know, like, why do you go to church? Why do you pray? I see you praying something. Why do you do that? You know, why do you act that way? You know, nobody else acts that way, in a good sense, you know, but it was something different about you. What's up with that? Please hear me. Don't just downplay those moments and say, well, you know, it's kind of just, it's just the way I live. Talk about Jesus, just like this blind guy. I tell you, Jesus changed my life. That's why I pray. Jesus changed my life, and I want to learn more about him, and I want to worship him. That's why I go to church. Don't hesitate to talk about those things. When people ask you questions about God and Jesus, be authentic in your answers. And you say, what do you mean by that, Mike? Let me tell you what I mean by that. You know, sometimes I find when people ask us questions about God and Jesus, we feel the need to speak kind of in spiritual jargon. Like we got to sound like we're holy and we know a lot of stuff. We kind of put our preacher voice on and we go for it and all that kind of. And I would just say to you, don't do that stuff. Don't do that stuff. Think about the blind guy here. You know, the blind guy was just authentic. When he got asked about it, he said, listen, I don't even know who this guy is exactly. I'm just telling you, this is my story. This is what happened to me. And it's no more complicated than that. I don't have an agenda. That was really his point. I don't have an agenda here. I'm just telling you, Jesus, this guy Jesus, he changed my life. You and I, when you get asked a question, just tell people what you know. You know, you don't need to sound spiritual about it. Just say, this is what Jesus has done in my life. This is why I believe him. And when they ask you a question and you don't know the answer, say, I don't know the answer. I'll see if I can find it, but I don't know. I'm just telling you, this is what the difference Jesus has made in my life. Listen, when you and I are afraid to do that, we are missing an opportunity. We have a story. Jesus wants us to tell the story. And if it's real for you, you won't, but you can hardly help yourself but to tell the story. You know, years ago, I heard this phrase, and it's always stuck with me, because here's another way to make sure you tell your story. I heard this phrase that said this. It said, your talk talks and your walk talks, but your walk talks louder than your talk talks. Never forgotten. Your talk talks, your walk talks, but your walk talks louder than your talk talks. You want to know one of the most powerful ways to tell your story? Is just live a different kind of life, the kind that Jesus would want you to live. In our world today, when you forgive like Jesus asked you to forgive, when you love like Jesus asked you to love, when you pray and trust God when times are hard and not just throw up your hands in despair, when you act in those ways, you will be different. And the world will notice. And you will have the opportunity to let your actions align with what you say. Your testimony cannot just be your actions. It needs to also include words at some point. But I tell you, when your words are the only things that are there for your testimony and they don't match up with your actions, that's when you're susceptible to be called a hypocrite, and perhaps rightly so. For this blind guy, I was blind, now I see. Jesus changed my life. I'm not embarrassed. I'm not ashamed. I don't understand it all. I just know Jesus changed my life.